Welcome to Third Eye Roll, where ancient wisdom gets decoded, demystified, and occasionally roasted. I'm Dr. Justine Lemos with Scarlet Trillia, here to serve up Vedic insights, spiritual real talk, and a healthy dose of side-eye. Each episode, we're diving into Vedic astrology, Ayurveda, Tantra, and the weird beauty of being human, with segments like cosmic, current events, story time with the Vedas and Shastras, WTF is that? And a mystic mic drop to leave you lit. No gurus, no fluff, just the good stuff. Welcome back to Third Eye Roll. I'm Dr. Justine Lemos. I'm here today with special guest Teo Semko, longtime practitioner and teacher of Kundalini Awakening Process. That is Dr. Glenn J. Morris's improved Kundalini Awakening Process. Welcome, Teo. How are you today?
I'm well. How are you, Justine?
I'm all right. So today we're going to dive into sādhanā, tapas, Tantra, neotantra, and its pathways. So let's just jump into the conversation.
Sounds good.
Happy Diwali, first of all. We are right at the new moon in Chitra Nakshatra, the star sign of the shining jewel, ruled over by Vishwakarma, the architect of the universe. And of course, Chitra is a star sign whose planetary ruler is Mars. And actually, this is really appropriate because this is where Mars kind of harnesses the martial aspect of Mars into becoming the architect and the one who is very precise. And in this way, because Mars is a great yogi, a great sadhika, this is where the practice gets refined with this new moon and with the celebration of Diwali.
Good stuff.
Indeed.
Darkness into light.
Yeah. So what do you want to tell us about practice and daily practice versus practice for transformation, if there is a versus, and sadhana or spiritual practice in the modern world?
Well, just to point out for people who may have experienced, say, a yoga class or yoga classes, that things were not always done this way specifically. And yoga shalas have existed for 100 years. There are some that are older, but the vast majority of folks who were learning hatha yoga, who were learning raja yoga, who were learning japa, etc., were typically learning from either their family or from pandits or from yogis, and they would be given a little bit of information and told to go practice it. So it wasn't necessarily a big social thing with everybody practicing together. Not that isn't done, meaning that does exist, but it's not the day-to-day mainstay of learning. The learning process would really be to be given an assignment, go off and practice it, come back, and then be given corrections, basically. And that process is very different from the current sort of commercialized aspect, which is built on dependency. It has to be for people to return again and again and make payments for allotted times, etc. The other thing is, because of time constraints, a lot of changes get made in what gets presented, and because of marketing. Because if a space has to be paid for in modern times, then we have to market according to the desires of people who may not actually know what's possible within what they could learn. And so they're coming for the thing that they think they want rather than the thing that they would want if they actually had a taste of something deeper. So,
and also it is quite true and substantiated that when yoga came to the West, there wasn't scope or there wasn't a template for something that could last a very long time and you wander into a shala and stick around for 6 or 7 hours during the day. And so there was I think, conscious and deliberate effort to formulate yoga classes based on jazzercise classes, actually. And this history has been pretty well established, which means 60-minute, 75-minute, or 90-minute blocks of time in which an activity is done. And I think that this is where yoga really got exercise-ified, though it was already happening in 19th century India. So many of the practices that take time or take more time or seemed to be less essential to what was becoming the body beautiful practice, like, for example, the practice of drishti, of eye movement, got relegated to, and not just relegated, just completely left out of the practice.
You similarly see a lack of warming kriyas that were a big part of hatha yoga before, typically, meaning it was common to do things like some pranayama and some drishti, eye warming exercises, eye gazing, etc., before then beginning some warming exercises for the joints and for the spine, before then beginning Surya Namaskar, before then going into asana practices and kriya practices and the like. So, and all of those things make a big difference in one's experience of the practice as one does it, in terms of each of those things shifts body consciousness. If one is not actually clearing out the stuck garbage in the visual cortex and in the interplay with the eye muscles, meaning those early eye warming exercises before even doing gazing, clears out the sticking points that are cleared out in modern psychotherapy through EMDR, the eye movement rapid desensitization, and through things like
spotting.
Brain spotting, exactly, which is an offshoot of that. So yogis did this every day for themselves, basically. And as a result of that, without having those sticking points, those stuck bits of information, stuck experiences, tactile and sensory and emotional experiences, now they're able to actually just abide in the mind stream much more easily. Sounds pretty important if what you're trying to achieve is samadhi. If you're if you're trying to actually achieve a state where you're not trapped in the little vortices and fluctuations of the mind, but rather are in the bigger waveforms of the mind. Those little eye movements that take 5 minutes or so, but are very unsexy when you're doing them, and I'm not going to put you on the cover of Yoga Journal. They're pretty important for the consciousness state. Similarly, doing warming kriyas, there are lots and lots of vinyasa yogis now who get injured constantly while doing fairly extreme stretches with fairly extreme corrections that wouldn't get injured as frequently if they were actually doing warming kriyas that are rotational exercises that have a different effect on lubrication of the joints, on removing adhesions in the muscles and fascia before you start to lengthen or stretch those muscles and fascia under duress. And the opening that's done during those kriyas. We're just talking about hatha yoga so far, much less all of the other aspects of yoga that are traditionally taught. Most yogis, too, it would be good to point out, practice more than one style of yoga, or more than one type of yoga, I should say, not style. Typically, they practiced a style. If they were doing hatha yoga, they were doing a style of it, yes. But they were also doing things like japa, recitation of mantra. They were also doing things like various forms of either self-inquiry or meditative yoga or devotional yoga or yoga of action or all of these other things. So the hatha yoga is basically a support for those other methods, especially for Raja yoga. Although it has some particularly powerful practices that, again, are no longer taught within the current space, at least not very widely, because they take a good bit of dedication and self-understanding with a small s, meaning understanding of the body personality as it's reacting to the work that's being done, so that you can actually track what you're doing as you do these more advanced or challenging practices without hurting yourself or without doing the exact opposite of what you're trying to do in terms of smoothing out and the mind stream. But with warming kriyas, performing kriyas also open up the body to the experience of bliss. Meaning, when we are lubricated, when we have enough space, when the fascia isn't contracted around the rib cage, the pelvis, the face, the jaw, etc., then we actually have the space to feel openness emotionally, spatially in terms of our proprioception. We have a greater sense of where the body is in space. We have a greater sense of balance if we're doing balancing postures. We have a greater sense of emotional balance, a lack of reactivity. Whereas the more we push ourselves doing repetition after repetition of, say, Surya Namaskar or longer vinyasas, yes, we're building up capacities, but we're also pressurizing ourselves, and that takes away the feeling of expansiveness and bliss. So we're looking for experiences of spaciousness, not speciousness, but spaciousness, bliss as aspects of the beingness, bliss, consciousness, or awareness itself that are part of the goals of the yogic practice. So many of the things that were taken out because they're not sexy or because of lack of time. Yoga, when it was originally taught in shalas, both in the United States in the early 1900s, you have the omnipotent in New York, in Nyack and Manhattan as well. And you have yoga shalas existing from about mid 1800s on in India as well. In those, and there was already sort of a gymnasium sort of, even before the jazzercise of the 60s and 70s that Justine already pointed out, which was a big reference for like Himmelman's yoga fitness and stuff like that. We had gymnastics and circus arts and things like that being mixed with and aspects of Indian wrestling being mixed into the early practices. But people came in and they practiced for a couple of hours, and they might not practice every day in the space. They might practice 2 or 3 days a week for a longer period, making the journey often by foot to get there, and then they would go home and practice a little bit or a lot on their own, separate from that. So,
but I do see. I just want to give a kind of shout out to the culture of modern yoga shalas, because in many ways they're filling a niche that isn't found in the culture elsewhere. For example, many people are no longer attending or don't attend churches or other congregations. And so there isn't a gathering place. And as we become more and more and more isolated, it just becomes a neutral
culturally,
common ground.
It's an extremely important thing to have a shared space of being where people are holding space for each other and actually exchanging and breathing together. So extremely important. So inspiring.
It is extremely important. And perhaps I always like to be hopeful that whatever yoga we have is the yoga for our time. That's my big hope, is that the yoga itself has a sentience and a consciousness unto itself, and that we have whatever yoga we need for whatever times we're in.
By bringing it up here, and we hope to reach at least a few people that will understand that this is something that's already being propagated by some of the teachers in some of those shalas as well, meaning they're doing their best to actually see within the consumer constraints of having to pay their rent or their mortgage on their space, how they can actually get the benefits of some of the traditional deeper practices along with the daily maintenance work that is so useful. I mean, people need, whether you call it self-care or daily practice, or whether your association of sadhana is just doing a set grouping of asanas, pranayama, etc., that may be achieving slow change and transformation in your body personality, but may not be achieving sort of the dramatic elements that are spoken of in the mythology of yoga. It's still doing very powerful things for keeping people from falling apart completely under the social pressures and economic pressures of the modern age. That said, the more that some of these rebellious, lovely teachers can actually begin to impart ways that people, or the expectation, the understanding that people can actually take stuff home and do stuff and have really rich, deep experiences where the practice itself or the elements of divinity that are represented, anthropomorphically and in sound and in geometry by mantra, yantra, etc. All of these aspects can teach rather deeply. And even the syncretic yogas, where people are doing, Christian yoga or Jewish yoga or Muslim yoga, etc. Which, of course, bodily postures and movements did exist, breath synchronized in all of those traditions in earlier ages too. But even, putting things back together syncretically, where they're in, prayer or devotion from a different system into a physical yogic system, for example, or into a meditative practice that enriches the contemplative systems that already exist in those religious traditions. Those things can be made deeper too, and all you need is a teacher who has a deep enough understanding themselves from going into a deeper transformative practice that can then impart pointers and say, hey, try this when you go home, and you'll get really rich, deep experiences of gnosis, of either consciousness and the dynamics of consciousness itself, or of a particular theistic aspect of experience, or a particular richness of unity. So there's powerful things to be had. And one recommendation I would make, both for teachers excited about this, maybe contributing to this movement, because it is a counter movement that's happening right now after 20 more people starting to do it. So I wouldn't say that it's a named movement, and perhaps that's a good thing, because as soon as we name movements, they tend to be commercialized, dissected, and their meanings tend to be changed. So
they become crystallized.
Perhaps better if this is just a spontaneous thing that's happening. But for both teachers and students, I encourage you to find yoga books written in whatever languages you can read that are written prior to the 1970s. And look at some of those early books in the Himmelman's, I've forgotten the title of his big, self-teaching book, but also Andre van Lijsbeth's Yoga Self-Taught. There were books on how to teach yourself yoga effectively that can give you a deep richness that runs parallel to what many of the 200-hour yoga teacher trainings provide at this point. So I would recommend looking at those, but also looking at some of the deeper books on the yoga tradition that existed prior to the 60s, many of which are available in PDF formats or in open electronic libraries. So, many of them are out of copyright at this point. They're public domain. So dive in. There's beautiful things there.
What's happening, or what do you see happening with the similar kind of transformation of Tantra in terms of, and by Tantra I mean authentic lineage Tantra, as it's coming into, because, I get advertisements for do your 200-hour tantric training, tantric yoga training, all online.
Yes.
Right? And then you look at the syllabi for these things, and it's like, it's like some mantra practice and like an understanding of a specific deity and maybe some type of ritual or something like that. It's and so I'm wondering what you see parallel with Tantra.
Well, in terms of, I would make similar recommendations, and if you can read books first on in your own language, whatever that happens to be, look at the overviews, historical overviews of what Tantra has meant. Tantra, both in terms of, well, first of all, it being something that is a large movement that has touched upon and informed Jainism, Bon, Shaivite, Ganapatya, Shakta, Vaishnavite, Surya Tantra in the Indian tradition. What haven't I mentioned amongst those traditions and offshoots of those? Vajrayana, of course, so Buddhist Tantra. Zen. It has touched Zen via some of the merging between the Chan movements in Japan and the tantric movements in Japan. There's several tantric lineages there too. And goes back to roots that exist in the Vedas and in some of the oral traditions that are non-Vedic, meaning you have things coming from the Dravidian tribal traditions that are outside of the Vedas, and it's a big part of tantric knowledge, especially practical tantric knowledge. There's elements of it that came from the Altai Plain. There's elements that came from the Swat Valley in what's now Pakistan and Kashmir. There's just huge elements that inform different areas of tantra, and through the movements of the spice routes and the silk and spice trades, you had pilgrims journeying along with the merchants and their protective mercenaries that were exchanging information with each other, that were often from very different traditions. So you had Sufis that were actually implementing things from other forms of Tantra and giving Sufi knowledge, for example, to those that were practicing Sanatana Dharma, and etc. You have Taoist knowledge creeping in. You have the Mahachina Tantra, which is literally Taoist knowledge being mixed with Shaivite knowledge, and so all sorts of really interesting mixes of practical applications of contemplative and inner transformation work. So that's being a background. Often people who are teaching now, as you said, are just teaching from one tiny little sliver of this vast web of traditions, which do not hold all of the same perspectives. Often their perspectives are at odds with each other, but their practical knowledge and the experiences of training them often give very similar experiences, even if the dogma is different. Many times these practical traditions grew up under government or local social customs that expected you to blend in. Otherwise, bad things happen. Meaning, enforcers don't like it when you are sort of preaching outside of the orthodoxy. So you do these sometimes heterodox or heretical practices, but you are syncretizing them with the Orthodox tradition and the Orthodox dogma, so that you're having a deeper experience practicing under a religious or non-religious philosophical background, but you're still maintaining sort of the external shell, the exoteric aspect of the religion. So with regards to what's out there, I don't think that there's any one teacher, even in the traditions within India, Nepal, Tibet, etc., that are teaching the broad overview. Most of them, and some of them are teaching it beautifully and richly. And it's a really good idea to look at his books that are historical overviews and read a bunch of them, because they're going to conflict with each other.
Right.
And meaning there's some very different opinions about historicity of particular aspects of tradition. And in many cases, they're based entirely, not entirely. In many cases, they're not coming from just the scholastic effort to be true to what is there in the record. In many cases, they're being informed by scholar practitioners who themselves come from a particular tradition and want to prove that their tradition is the oldest and the authentic one, and everything else comes from them. And you see that back and forth between, many different Western scholars, as well as Indian and Nepali and Tibetan scholars as well. So once you start to recognize that that's a pattern, you can read richly and understand that lots of stuff is going back and forth between these traditions over time. There's nothing that's truly pure except for the experience of the practitioner that is using these tools and getting the experience. And that's really important to remember if you are interested in learning in more than one tradition, or learning sort of the universal human experience of this versus just a coherent dogmatic line. Although, if that's your interest, you can find that too. So, meaning if you wish to just be immersed in one particular dogma tradition, there's certainly plenty of that available. But there are wonderful courses on Sri Vidya. There are good books available, which any decent sadhak, any practitioner who has done the work, can guide someone else through the process of these. There's good enough books out there describing Mahavidya practices, describing Navdurga practices, describing Saptamatrika practices, etc. So some of the richer sort of deity practices in Tantra, both deity as geometric principles of divinity and also as anthropomorphized principles. There are aspects on the non-dual tantras that do not require any religious subscription to understand them deeply. Meaning there's multiple forms of non-dual practice, understanding the nature of consciousness itself rather than approaching that necessarily as a divinity. There's other ones that do give sort of a deity name to it, but mostly it's about non-dualism. And then there's other aspects that are completely, follow this dogma. It's all about the contract with the deity, the same way that Abrahamic traditions are. So these all exist. And again, if you start with some broad overviews and then start to look at practices, caveat emptor, you want to be cautious as you approach any of this and make sure that there is some sense that practicing a particular way is going to give a particular fruit. There is no real safety in Tantra. Know that, both in terms of interactions with people and in terms of interactions with the practices themselves. It's very powerful practices that can really radically shift your physiology, even overnight. Doing a practice for an entire night can really rapidly shift your mind state. And if you push things too hard, if you do it without a state of self-loving and being in a state of kindness, it's quite easy to push yourself into imbalance, which then would bring you to a practitioner like Justine to help you out Ayurvedically to get you back.
For people enmeshed in the modern world and its pressures, I find that even 15 minutes of meditation or like even a very, very simple practice is often too much for them to allow themselves to do, really. And so for that person, what do you recommend? But yet they want to experience meditation. They want to experience the fruits of these deeper practices.
What I find is that people that have had to do some sort of deep practice or study in some area of their life can usually use their experience with that, whether it was training a musical instrument, training in athletics, training in dance, training in song, training in engineering, etc., something that required some degree of dedication. For them, it's usually possible to point that out to them, that they have been through this before, and give them just a little piece at a time, tell them to actually wedge that between two things that they do every day so that it becomes part of their habitual orientation of the day. Most people who have done that kind of rigorous practice in something tend to have some degree of organization to the way that they do things in their day. People who are just sort of going with the flow or being pushed by the feed, social media feed and everything else, where the world is just coming at them and they're not really sort of setting their experience, it's going to be harder for them. And for them, being able to come into a shala is a really good thing. Meaning if they can actually, because usually those people are seeking community and communion with their fellow beings. And if you could provide that and give them tastes of experiences and also develop a little bit of a habit, a really short one that's easy for them to do when they're in the shala and easy for them to do when they take home, they can start to actually move in that direction. And something simple like working with, say, marmas and drishti, which emotional freedom technique, which is very popular, basically using pressure point tapping and eye movements. It takes a minute to go through emotional freedom technique. And it really does reset the consciousness, even just doing it once, regardless of what you're focusing on when you're doing it. Meaning if you're doing it for anxiety, if you're doing it for, a recurring thought that's bothering you or something like that, it also tends to give a nice little reset. And you're doing two yogic techniques merged together, meaning the use of marma or acupressure points, and the use of eye movement. And that in and of itself, even though it's, EFT it's popular enough at this point that lots of people who wouldn't have been comfortable doing it 10 years ago would be more than comfortable to do it now as a social thing. It can be done socially in a yogashala. And even though it's not this esoteric, exotic cultural practice,
Right.
it brings them into the awareness that you can use these simple tools to rapidly shift the state of your body and your mind, to shift your emotional state. And from there, it's much easier to expand that into bigger practices that are more dramatic and have even larger effects. Also, if you can anchor something that clears, like EFT or resets, and something short that actually generates a state that they like, do one after the other, those two things can become an anchor for the rest of their practice that they build, whether it's yogic practices or learning an instrument, learning a language, learning whatever it happens to be, something else that's skill building. And the ability to build skills is becoming more and more important as jobs no longer exist for more than a year or two because they're being reshaped by AI and everything else. So we need to be able to be agile.
Almost all of the practices that I teach include marma and drishti and these things because of my training in Ayurveda and classical Indian dance. But what I'm finding that's really interesting is that 5 years ago, people were really interested in very, very physical practice. Now, this could be just because of the aging, like population aging, but I don't think it is. Now, people want to come in and take a nap. And people, they want to say hi to each other, have some experience of, being in a group, breathing a little bit, and then they want to lie down and have deep rest. And I think that there's a collective exhaustion that is being experienced.
Yes, collective overstimulation, both by news and by constantly looking at scrolling movement pictures. Both, on dating apps, on social media, on news feeds, everything. Our bodies were not designed to do that. And the people who created the feeds that actually scroll, they know that. Basically, when you scroll something where you're moving it upwards constantly, and your eyes are flicking upwards, it's putting you into an anxious trance, a buyer's trance, which is what they want. As opposed to if you were scrolling down and none of our feet scroll down, it would actually calm the system to some degree. And if you hold the eyes still, of course, that allows you to have a clarity of consciousness that allows you to be more immune to the influences of outside persons, culture, commercials, etc., which is not desirable if they're trying to sell you things. Similarly, if you're swiping left and swiping right with a dating app, you're rather than actually getting a deeper sense of who people are, whether or not you choose to be with them for even the length of a date, there's this disconnect where you're going into just sort of image-based connection, short cursory connection, rather than a deep sense of satisfying connection. And that's to the advantage of the dating companies too. It's been proven that they will intentionally try to set up relationships that last just long enough for you to stay with the platform, but need to go back to the platform meaning they don't want to actually find you somebody that's a good long-term match. So,
Well,
we've been habituated this way.
A side to side glance, right? It's not.
It is, except if we slow that down and we're not looking at moving things, but rather looking at stationary objects as we move the eyes, then we calm the system, as you well know. So moving to the need to rest that you're finding from people coming into the shala, both Ayurvedically and people coming in for yoga classes too. It shouldn't be forgotten that one of the first things that was done in more classical yoga practices, many practices from 100 years ago, even 60 years ago, was starting off with a long shavasana and then ending with a long shavasana. In some yoga traditions, even doing shavasana between every other asana that you do until the body resets fully from whatever stimulation it's been given by breathing through a particular less relaxed posture. So you would do, a standing posture, then lay down on the floor and do shavasana.
Yep.
And then you would do a back bend and then lay down on the floor and do shavasana, etc. So also, if we look at the older summary yoga texts that put together many of the previous texts in the medieval period, those summary texts refer to shavasana not just as one posture where you're lying on the back with the arms and legs out at 45 degrees, but rather as lying like a corpse in any posture on the floor and just sinking in the ground, completely empty of tension. And that process, lo and behold, is now showing up in Western studies. It's being given to vets with PTSD. It's being given to people with anxiety. It's being given to those of us who are neurodivergent that have hyperstimulated systems as floor time, right? If you look up floor time, they will have you either lying on a hard surface rather than on a soft couch or a soft bed, lying down on a hard surface and just sinking into the ground with each exhalation. In some cases, putting the legs up the wall, like legs up the wall pose, so that even more blood flow is flowing towards the head and towards the heart and relaxing those, etc. So yeah, these are incredible resets, and they're a big part of what classical yoga was in terms of hatha yoga, in terms of the physical yogas, because if you just do a bunch of stimulating postures, you're just overstimulating the system. You're putting the body into sympathetic fight or flight, or for some of us, into freeze responses as a result of overstimulation, etc. Whereas if you balance the parasympathetic deep relaxation with stimulation, either by going back and forth steadily between them, where you do one relaxation and then you do the stimulation and then you relax again, or by learning to relax and then bring some stimulation into the relaxation, go back into a relaxed state, more stimulation in the relaxation, etc. That brings us into what again? Samadhi. So our left nostril is more dominant when we're in a parasympathetic relaxation response. Our right nostril is more dominant when we're in a sympathetic activation response. When we are in both of those equally, when both nostrils are breathing equally, we go into an absorbed state where we have greater awareness of the mind flow and less vortices or disturbance of the mind. And so balancing sympathetic and parasympathetic responses is a part of, that's really the essence of hatha yoga, meaning hatha, ha is solar, which is the stimulation response. Tha is lunar, which is the relaxation response. And putting the two together, you actually get drawn into samadhi. And from there, you can do your Raja yoga, which is the deeper meditative yogas. So hugely important. And right now, people need, as you said, the relaxation response more than anything else. So even just getting people to say, if you can tell people, hey, this is yoga, go home and lay on your floor and just with every exhalation, sink the body weight into the floor and melt into the floor and do that for 3 to 5 minutes. If you tell people to do that when they first wake up, to get out of their soft bed where they may have had agitated dreams, get onto the floor before they do anything else and sink. And then from there, wake up and do anything active that they want to do the same thing when they get home from work or when their kids come home from school. Say, kids, get on the floor, lay down for a little bit, stare at the ceiling, and just sink into the floor with don't look at the phone while you're doing it. Just take 3 minutes just to sink. It makes such a difference in terms of people feeling agency, people feeling not exhausted anymore, people feeling relaxed in their bodies, people not getting injured as frequently because their fascia isn't being clenched constantly. So, these basic things are a really good start at moving towards being able to do the mythological yogas that bring deep bliss and experiences of union with universality or divinity and all of the wonders, which are very real. These things exist, but you have to get from here to there. And the starting process is by reevaluating. Even if you think you don't have much time, and most people will claim that they don't have much time, just doing that floor practice may be more useful than doing 5 minutes of Surya Namaskar at the beginning. So
Absolutely. And it just makes me think also about, in Ayurveda, when we do treatments, if we have the luxury to do so, we do 2 people working on one so that with perfect synchronization, so that the right and left sides of the body and the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system, the solar and lunar, get placed into biorhythms, because we have two halves to our brains. And this creates this state of great samadhi in the treatment itself and a reset for the entire nervous system.
And the left to right can do that. And the top to bottom, meaning if you have one practitioner at the top and one at the bottom, you have this deep embodiment coming together with the clarification of the mind, which is something else that's lacking because of our degree of screen time in modern society. So yeah, the luxury of that, and this is something that I think you're doing brilliantly in your Ayurveda shala, is, people for the most part do not believe or simply financially cannot afford to do a full panchakarma, whether that's in India or in a clinic here. But being able to do 3 hours, many people can afford that. And if they can afford that with one practitioner, great. If they can afford it with two, even better. Even if they're doing that just once or twice a year, it's going to have a radical effect on resetting their nervous system.
Or even, it's really nice if people can find their way to doing it bi-monthly. And if you really look at the cost, and as a monthly cost, if you're doing it every other month, it's not that high. And the amount of benefit you get from 3 or 4 hours of Ayurvedic treatment that is specifically cultivated and created for you and your imbalances is going to be manifold in terms of just overall quality of life.
And if you compare that cost to the costs that we incur when we are running around in a brain fog and exhausted all day, having to drink extra coffees beyond whatever coffee you would want to drink just to get things moving, having to drink perhaps alcohol at night or take gummies or whatever it is to put yourself to sleep because you're so revved up. If you can do this once a month or once every other month, etc., it's going to cost the same or less, and you're going to end up feeling
the wine and the gummies. And the
exactly.
Beer and the gummies. You're
going to end up feeling much better. So, and you can still have those things recreationally without needing to have them because your body is in such disarray. If you so choose,
All right. Anything else that you'd like to share today?
Well, just on the notion of sadhana and tapas, which, people who have taken a yoga teacher training would have been, made familiar with those concepts at the very least, if not actually done one. But most people who just go into yoga classes don't really hear these terms unless they're hearing sadhana is, whatever set of asanas you do on a daily basis, which that can be a form of sadhana. That said, sadhanas are usually practices that have a specific fruit or a specific set of shifts in mind when you're doing the practice. Meaning, if you do this practice for X period of time, in the vast majority of cases, it's going to bring about a radical transformation in either your state of consciousness or in your play of emotions or in the way that your body functions, etc. And they're really powerful things. And they've been established by watching people do them and by having people that are, of course, transmitting the practices do them themselves for generations. They are really powerful things. In the same way that there are practices that have been adopted by modern physiotherapists that can make radical shifts in somebody who's gone through let's say a cesarean section or has gone through a car wreck and needs to regain, the motility of their body. We can bring people from having almost complete loss of mobility back to mobility. There are Ayurvedic processes like this that are much more radical than panchakarma for people that are born with, mismatched limb lengths and all sorts of other things that are more nuanced than the allopathic equivalents of those same practices. The same thing within Tantra and Yoga. There are practices that will bring you into a deep union between consciousness and body, a deep union between consciousness and the bigger consciousness, between your microcosmic internal experience and the experience of the bigness of the universe, so to speak, or particular personalities that are stamps of the bigness of the universe. Archetypes, etc. All of these things exist and, know that they're pretty wondrous. And again, if you're coming from a specific religious tradition that is outside of the realm of Asia Minor and the Near and Far East, know that those things probably exist in the older periods of your own religious tradition, if not today, in some of the sects. Meaning, you do have in in various forms of quote unquote orthodoxy, and there's so many of those, within Judaism, within Christianity, within Islam, you also have these kinds of deep transformative practices that do exist. Internal practices of breath, practices of repetition of prayer. They exist in these traditions. And if you are secular and you have religious trauma and dogma just, makes you twist up inside and doesn't feel good, know that these things exist in the non-dual and non-religious traditions of the East as well. And you can look there if you're wanting to have a deeper experience of the richness of being without actually linking it to some particular dogma, at least to a big degree. So
because many of these practices, if not all of these practices, do work on a biological level. And we are all walking around with this relatively the same biology. We've all got the same template. And so if you do certain things with the physiology, you do certain things that create shift in the biology, in the hormone states, and in the endocrine system, in the endocrine glands. And if anybody with a body repeats those things, they're going to have similar types of experience.
The principal notion of Tantra is interdependence, meaning it's these webs of interdependence. Sutras are texts on one particular topic. Tantras are texts that weave together different topics and show how they interplay, how astrology interplays with psychology, interplays with medicine, interplays with practices of meditation, etc. And understanding how physiology, the physical, interplays with your emotional states, your states of consciousness, your states of connection to others, meaning your social states, and the like, how repetition of particular sounds actually influences the physiology, which then influences the state of consciousness, how the use of particular colors and particular geometry influence brainwave states, which then shift the way that the body is functioning. So all of these interplays have been mapped out practically over thousands of years. Tantra itself is not that old, but many of the traditions that it draws from are. And we have evidence in, friezes and statuary and everything else of people applying these very tools going back thousands of years. So, meaning well before the birth of Christ. So, and we have evidence within, for example, if you're talking about Christ, within the Essene tradition itself, there's a bunch of practices that are yogic practices, meaning Christ was a member of a particular ascetic sect in Judaism, and they had practices that they were doing on a daily basis. And there's some evidence that during his wanders, he was also learning other practices as well and bringing those into the belief system that he already had, and then presenting this new message, basically. So, so understand that regardless of your religious or secular background, powerful, powerful stuff exists in addition to all of the science that is mapping out things they think for the first time in allopathic science. And there's really good information coming out of that, including things that can inform how you apply your more traditional practices. But at the same time, there's lots of stuff that is already known in these traditional forms of medicine, yogic practice, etc., that everybody who practices those things knows they work because they do it over and over again with their clients, with themselves, etc. And it gets very specific results. And those things are only now being mapped by allopathic medicine. For example, there are ingredients in Ayurveda, in Unani, in Tibetan medicine, Soaripa, etc., in Chinese medicine, in African medicine, in Greek medicine, that have been used for generations upon generations that are only now being studied.
And this is where it gets a little scary because of the extraction of knowledge and the creation of,
patents that will prevent the use of traditional knowledge and things like that. That is, worrisome. Yes.
Exactly. And just the extraction of cultural knowledge and the repackaging of it both in terms of New Age traditions and practices, for example, tumo, or, just the extraction of curcumin from turmeric and its overuse. And so this is where things get really...
and things being packaged as superfoods
complex.
that have limited geographical regions in which they can be grown, and the people who use them to stay healthy now no longer can afford them because they're being exported and gentrified to people who don't even really need them and are not using them properly. They're just being added as luxury ingredients to things because it's the latest trend.
So what to do?
What to do is get excited and learn. The more people get excited and learn, the harder it is to be shaped by marketing alone. I have no problem with people being wealthy and abundant from beneficial exchange, but beneficial exchange is not the same thing as strangulating resources and causing non-useful monopolies that are actually harmful to the population. So let's all learn about economics and Ayurveda and yoga and everything else, and understand how we can actually shape systems that are beneficial exchange rather than constricting things in ways that damage the health of individuals and the ecology. So may you never thirst. Thank you so much for the conversation. I hope everyone enjoyed it. Om Namah Shivaya. Much love to everyone. Happy Diwali. Okay. Thank you.